Do you ever feel the dice in D&D are just too static? Like, you really only have two outcomes.
I see what you're getting at, Ted. In D&D, there are only D&D players that are losers and winners.
I'm Nerdarchy Ted.
I'm Nerdarchy Steve. Welcome to Nerdarchy, for nerds, by nerds.
Now let's see if this video passes or fails.
Alright, so we're going to be discussing Dungeons & Dragons as a strictly pass-fail kind of system, at least rules is written and the way it's kind of designed.
You know, there's a lot of different rule sets out there for RPGs across genres, rule sets, dice choices, and, you know, while some of them don't go with that, there's a lot of them that are in that strictly pass-fail, and D&D is kind of like the creme de la creme.
It's the granddaddy, right, of that type of system. And essentially what a pass-fail system is when you roll the dice to see what the outcome is, you either succeed or you don't for the most part. The only place there's any real wiggle room in the rules as written, you know, without implementing any of the options and some of the other rules we'll get into later, is in saving throws where a failed save or a pass save is like a half effect.
Right. So what are some of the systems out there that aren't just pass-fail?
So, I mean, of the systems that we've played, I know, there is the Powered by the Apocalypse games, Quest RPG, and Star Wars from Fantasy Flight Games all have different variations of a system that is not strictly just pass or fail.
Before we go any further, if you like these videos and the articles that we do over on nerdarchy.com and you'd like to support us, why not come check us out over on Patreon and support us over there?
Over on Patreon, we are making content for both players and DMs alike. Every month, you're going to receive drop-in encounters for your games, sometimes maps from our very own games, print-and-play magic item cards made from magic items that we create. We're making spells, feats, subclasses, races, you name it, we're probably doing it. There's even a chance to game with us, Nerdarchy, over there. There will be a link in the description as well as one of these cards up here for a free patron download sampler. You can kind of get an idea of what you're going to receive every month for free.
I guess the first question is, how does a non-pass-fail system actually work?
So both Quest and Powered by Apocalypse games work very similar. There's a range where you fail. There's a range where you succeed with a consequence. And then there's also just a success. And then in Powered Apocalypse, there's like a super success. And also, I guess, in Quest as well, because you have like a critical success, right? So both of those games, and one of them just uses 2d6 plus a stat, where the other one just uses a d20, no stat, no nothing, it's just the naked die roll.
Right. And I like these aspects. I like succeeding with a consequence. And I've been thinking for a while of like how I might work something like that or workshop something like that into a D&D aspect. But, with Powered by the Apocalypse, one of the things that I absolutely love about that system is it rewards failure. So in the straight up, you fail, you roll too low, all right, get an XP, but you failed. And sometimes it's fail and something happens. So it's a lot of fun. And each roll is built into whatever power or ability that you wind up using.
Yeah, and then so Fantasy Flight Games put out a Star Wars game, and that doesn't actually use nice numbers at all. It has all different. It has all the polyhedrals for the most part, or a good portion of them. But in there you have triumphs, despair, and despairs, which are like your crit successes, crit fails. You have succeed, you have fail, and then you have advantages and disadvantages, right? And you build a pool of dice, roll all of them, and then you sort out what you have. And your successes and your failures cancel each other out. Your disadvantages and your advantages cancel each other out. Triumphs and despairs, they stay. So you could succeed, have a bunch of disadvantages, and also have like complications happen. Or you could just have, a total botch and nothing but complications happen, or a despair, something really bad happens, or you could fail, but you gain some minor advantage. So like, there's a lot of interpretation that's required from the GM, with those dice. And also there's a bit of negotiating back and forth between the GM and the player on what I can add to that pool.
Right. And it's this very interpretative dice pool mechanic. Once you get the hang of it, it is a lot of fun. We haven't dived into too many campaigns with this, but I felt like by the time we were halfway through the game, it was very easy, like, okay, just push. All right, this is what I've got. Yeah. And the fact that you can have a triumph and a despair, a critical success and a critical failure in the same moment is kind of cool. It's like, all right, well, I cut your head off, but I just lost my arm. Holy crap, that's what a move that one was.
So, yeah, and also even with that game, like there were apps that made it even easier. So if you wanted to roll digitally and then it would just tell you what you got because it sorted them for you. So before we go any further with that stuff, let's bring it back to D&D and it being a pass-fail system. Let's talk about some of the cons and pros.
All right, so let's start off with, what is the good? The ultimate pro is the ease of play. If you don't have to worry about, the nuances and figuring out all of those nuts and bolts, it's just easy. All right, the guy's got an 18 armor class, I got a +5 to hit. I know if I roll a 13 or better on this die, I got this. And the number of times that we've played games where the DM just straight up tells you what your target number is, or you've figured it out through rounds of play, it's like, all right, this is what I need. And as soon as that die drops, it's one way or the other. While the core rule set of D&D isn't easy, once you know how all the dice work, rolling that D20, boom, yes or no.
Yeah, you might have a crit success, a crit fail. They only apply to certain things. And the rules as written, it's very specific, kind of like what happens. So there isn't like a ton of interpretation there either, right? Where, compared to those other systems we described, well, if you get a success with some kind of complication, now you have to come up with what that complication is on the fly. Maybe the GM lets the players come up with their own complications, and then they kind of yay or nay them, or the GM just straight up comes up with them. I've definitely done a little bit of both in my games. I'm kind of open to the interpretation. If the players give me something good, if I think they're trying to get one over on me, I'd probably shoot it down and give them one of my own. Or maybe modify a yes and, right? Or something along those lines. But that is a lot harder or more complicated than just going, I swing my axe, it hit or it missed.
And I know, like, with the Quest RPG, like, there are, like, automatic things that are like, oh, here are some suggestions. Yeah. I know the Quest companion app actually gives you, oh, well, here's some things, and you can kind of go through it and roll randomly a number of times until you find something that you like. But it's also good that when you're playing these kinds of systems for the GM to be like, oh, well, I'm going to come up with some ahead of time so that if something comes up. But with the way a role-playing game goes, it's got fluidity where they might go in a direction you weren't thinking, and now your pre-list doesn't make sense anymore.
Yeah, for sure. And just they're harder. And also, the next pro is, it requires less creativity on the fly. Some of these might even see that as a con, but really, like, if you're a GM and maybe you're new to the game and you got a lot going on, and then all of a sudden, like, something comes up and now you have to juggle a new narrative element you aren't prepared for, like, that can be a little bit hard. But with a simple pass or fail system, you don't have to worry about that. They either did the thing or they didn't. It's
a barrier to play for new players, so that's why we put it in the pro section. So the last pro is the outcomes are just set. Your expectations are there. You don't have to kind of figure it out. You don't have to say, oh, well, does this, does that. It's just boom. You have it or you don't.
You cast your spell, the spell happens if it happens. You swing your sword, you either stab them or you don't. It's very simplified.
And that makes it a lot easier to be able to get to play. I mean, D&D is considered, the world's best, role-playing game, or the most popular role-playing game. So these are just the reasons why, we think it's possible. Now the downside is, what are the cons of a pass-fail system?
So I guess one of the biggest ones is you're only rewarded for success, right? Where Powered by Apocalypse games, and there's also some other games that I've played in where failure and complications actually reward the players with XP. in D&D, if you didn't do the thing you set out to do, you get bunkus. You get nothing.
I mean, just a number of times that, we've run away from monsters is like, well, you didn't defeat the monster. There's no XP to be gained there. It's like, but we tried, we attempted. Nope, no XP. Cross it off.
I mean, it's one of the things I like about Powered by Apocalypse and some other systems out there where you get XP for failure, because I do believe you learn a lot more oftentimes from your failures than you do from your successes.
And it encourages people to try things. Yeah, I mean, there are characters or players who are like, oh, well, I'm not good at this particular skill, so I'm going to make sure that every session I'm trying that just to kind of milk the extra XP. Yeah. But when you look at it from the other standpoint, like, it's there to say, okay, well, you are learning through failure. So yeah, this makes sense, and it encourages people to try new things. The next con is, the more static combat. When there is not the ebb and flow that comes with the, oh, well, you succeed, but here's this consequence where it's like a give and take elements, where it's like, okay, I make my turn. All right, I've pre-rolled. I hit 17, 15, and 13. Okay, the 13 misses. These two do a total of 12 damage. Next. It doesn't have the same impact where, there could be those hinge moments.
Yeah, more narrative systems are the ones that tend to be systems that rely less on a pass-fail. So, you get that ebb and flow, like you're saying, like, oh, you succeed with a consequence and something happens, right? Like, you're trying to cast a spell, it goes off, but, you didn't roll quite high enough. You get the effect you wanted, but you also get a glitch. There's a side effect, right? And so then something unexpected happens that, you have to come up with at the table, which does make things harder, but it also makes things more interesting and fun.
And it gives more narrative elements for the next player to kind of, work off of. With Star Wars, I happen to have 3 advantages left over off of my roll. I'm going to pass those on to the next player in the queue. And now Dave's like, hey, what can I do with this? Can I do this? And I do this. So the next action can greatly change, whereas all of a sudden, oh, I just rolled a despair. Holy crap. The villain was able to hit the button, and now a whole nother wave of enemies are coming in, and now the situation has greatly changed. Do we have to flee? Do we have to run? Or do we stand and fight and let this be, a glorious end?
I mean, even if the DM plans dynamic elements in a combat to try and make it more interesting, the pitching and yawing of a ship deck, having to jump over chasms and, or pillars are rising and falling during the combat, requiring acrobatics and athletics checks during the combat. All you've really introduced is more chances to pass or fail in that quote unquote dynamic. Maybe they can come up with interesting ways to use these things, but at the end of the day, you're probably going to end up having to make more checks that are going to be pass or fail.
And truth be told, those things are typically like lair actions and always go off at initiative 20. So like you can always plan on that of like, okay, well, all I have to do is wait for this and then I can go. It's not like, oh, well, this round this is going to happen at 15 and next round it's going to happen at 13. So the ebb and flow is not there. Even those elements that are dynamic and do add a lot to the game, they still fall into that static mechanic because they're at a set point usually.
And it also, again, like to add them to a pass-fail system, it is definitely a lot more work for the DM, and they have to put a lot more forethought into it.
Indeed. So with all of that, in order to, have this pass-fail system of knowing, yes or no, it's going to require a greater rules mastery, thus having another barrier to play for that newer GM, newer game master. So therefore, that's a con of there's so many times that the GM is like, or a person has said, no, I'm not going to run a game because I don't feel I know the rules enough to be able to do that.
Yeah, the pass-fail systems tend to be crunchier games and more mechanics heavy. With I think like the Star Wars game being one of the exceptions where it does have a system beyond pass-fail, but it also is mechanically very crunchy, right? But usually the more narrative systems tend to be rules light, so there are less rules to have to worry about and learn. Games like Pathfinder and Dungeons and Dragons, and some of the more crunchy games out there, that kind of account for everything. That means the more they account for, the more rules they are, the more mastery is going to be required for you as a player.
Now, if you're lucky and you happen to have a great rules master at your table and they're like, look, I'll handle any rules questions, you just handle narrative elements, and you trust that player, that's fabulous. And I've seen tables like that, completely succeed. But not everyone is that fortunate, and therefore some people are like, look, I'm just not willing to get behind that GM screen, that DM screen, because there is too many books here to take it.
Yeah, and when I say player, I mean everyone, including the dungeon master or game master, as the case may be. So the next one is one that we dealt with for a very long time in a lot of our games. And honestly, I think it is still more of a past problem of the past that still pops up from time to time, but it does seem to create a more adversarial role between the dungeon master and the players. If you're in a game that is only pass or fail, there's a bunch of rules, except for the rules that the dungeon master decides to make up on the fly, which again, those tend to be pass or fail as well. This creates this like us versus them kind of narrative. I mean, even in some of the games that I played in 5e where it is more collaborative and more of us trying to build a story together, even with the dungeon master, I've definitely still seen a holdout when the player is like, let's create a separate chat for the final conflict so the DM doesn't know what we're planning, right? Or what our moves are going to be. So even then there's still an element of that where, games that have very little rules and you're kind of like making up everything as you go. Like some of these games are literally designed to, as the GM, to not really do a lot of prep or roll a couple random rolls, and just go forth and play. With Dungeons and Dragons and Pathfinder, that's a little bit harder. It takes a little bit more experience as a GM to do that. But like I said, it creates this like barrier.
And this is something that has been a problem for me for many years with gaming, and I like the way things are flowing now, where it definitely feels like it's a collaborative storytelling game, and sometimes like we don't touch dice, sometimes it's just role playing through what's have you, and that's fine and fabulous, for those who enjoy that. But there are definitely still stories within the current rule set where people are like, oh yeah, my DM is out to get me, and I got to look at this. And I've had games where like the DM is like, well, we'll just see what the dice have to say, and I'm like, but it's a role playing thing. Like, can't you just give me a kind of heads up? So every GM, every group is going to handle this particular situation differently. And when I look at it, yes, there are some groups who still go very heavy down this road, and it does feel like, as Dave says, there's got to be the side chat amongst just the players because they're in it for their character's survival. And the GM, no holds barred. This is what I'm putting in there, and I don't care whether you live or die. My story is not hinged upon your success or failure. It is what it is. And I'm like, oh my God.
So the final con is it rewards min-maxing. But I will say any game that really relies on system mastery rewards min-maxing, right? And you can min-max in almost any game. But for the most part, the more rules there are, the more mastery required, the more opportunities there are to min-max, and probably the more combinations you can create. And min-maxing in and of itself is not necessarily always bad. We see plenty of it at our tables, but we're also very narrative as well. But if it's the only thing that a player focuses on, it can take away from the enjoyment from others at the table, especially if they're trying to just like one up everybody. And then also it creates more of a challenge for the GM to like figure out, okay, how do I challenge this one player without annihilating the rest of the table? Because those players didn't care about min-maxing. They just want to make this cool character they may had an idea for, and it may not be the most optimal build. If you have a bunch of players that are not optimized, and then the one player is min-maxed to the gills, they're going to be like destroyed and yawning through everything, or the rest of the group is going to be hard-pressed in every encounter. just because you wanted to challenge that one player.
Now, I've had interactions with other players that are out there, and Nelson from Infinite Roleplay, we used to game with quite a lot, and his concept is he is the immersive power gamer. He loves making characters that are min-maxed, but that's not going to take away from his role playing. He still wants to create the character and do all the things that other people do with role playing, and he's fabulous, but not everybody is willing to go down that kind of line. I like to make characters that are effective. It's not always important that I've got every little increment figured out of always picking the best, most damaging spell and most effective. It's too much work and not enough payout for my time. I pick things that I think are going to be fun, and I pick things that are going to make sense. But yeah, there is still a little bit of a min-maxer in me, but it's not the most important thing. I want to have fun at the table, and whatever makes that happen, makes that happen.
All of that being said, right, that is D&D at the core, but if you go to the Chapter 8 of the Dungeon Master's Guide, there is a resolution and consequences section, and basically goes, these are all the rules for Dungeons & Dragons, but if you want to make it more like one of those other narrative games, here's some things you can do. And it literally states things, well, maybe you needed a 17 hit, but you rolled a 16, maybe the DM can let you hit, and then there's a consequence, right? Sounds like some of these other systems that we're talking about. So again, like there, as the DM, you have a lot of wiggle room. There's always optional rules you can do. And even the creators of the game kind of acknowledge that. And I feel like in this section, they pay homage to those other games that are more narrative in style and don't have a strict pass or fail. So you can implement it in your game. I think if you're going to implement that kind of stuff in a game like Dungeons and Dragons, especially with players that maybe are new to these concepts, you should talk to the group and explain, hey, this is what I would like to do. And sometimes, if, maybe that you create a range, I think there should be an agreement between you, the GM, and the other players at the table as to how you want this to work. So there are some guidelines, and you're not just like doing it willy-nilly, and there's consistency. Like everyone knows kind of what to expect.
Absolutely. And if you've got a new game starting, this is a great thing to be able to talk about during session 0. If you have already got a campaign going and this is just being brought to light, why not pause the game and say, hey, look, we're going to have a mini session 0 now and add some of these elements or discuss some of these elements, and you can figure out whether the group agrees to it or not. I know at the time of us recording this, I have a session 0 that's coming up in a handful of days, and there's some questions that I have from these optional rules of like, hey, do we want to play with these kind of stuff or not? So it's the great element of collaboration and working together so that everybody's happy.
Now, I will say that D&D is a pass-fail system, but built into some of the rules mechanic, there is fail and fail worse.
Indeed. There's throughout the editions, there's been, if you roll a natural 1 or if you fail by 5 or more or 10 or more, there is these greater effects. Now,
that's 5e. That's specifically 5. In previous edition, those like greater effects would have just been save or suck. Like if you failed, I believe it's Medusa's petrification by 5 or more, instead of having an onsetting effect, it just happens now. Where in previous editions, if you failed your first save, that was it. You were done. Hand over your character sheet, right? And now, like, the rules are a bit more forgiving, but there is, like, some of these monsters where if you fail your save by 5 or greater, there's an kind of like an extreme effect.
Yeah, and these things, are interesting. And I think that they could be, spread out amongst more of the different monsters. But these are the gems for DMs who are like, all right, I want to add this chaos element into the game because you don't know what the dice are going to do until you're at that moment. And then there's no planning for it because it's like, oh, okay, it happened or it didn't.
Well, also, that's a cool place to modify monsters, too, where, like, if it's a normal monster that doesn't have something like that, maybe, the dragon they're fighting, it's, it breathes fire. But if you fail by 5 or more, not only do you take the damage, the full damage instead of half damage, you're on fire, right? And you have to put yourself out. And there's other rules in the game where you could go look and find it and be like, oh, and implement that. So it could be like a nasty surprise that you throw in there that the players weren't expecting and kind of keep them on their toes.
You know, and that's always a great thing.
So what do you think? What kind of games do you like playing? Do you like pass or fail systems? Do you like systems that are more narrative and, you know, you can succeed with consequences? Let us know down in the comments and share your favorite moments, either from those consequences or pass fail systems, with the Nerdarchy community below.
While you're down there, don't forget to do all those fun things like, share, subscribe. Even go ahead and ring that notification bell so you don't miss a single video.
Quick reminder, Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, we drop new videos here on the channel, so come on back and check it out to see what's new. But you can't wait till then. No worries, we got you covered. Way back when we played Star Wars, so we did a Star Wars RPG review up in this card here, and our post-game thoughts on that.
So until next time, stay nerdy.